Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, Book 2. Moral virtues can best be acquired by practice and habit. They imply a right attitude toward pleasures and pains. A good man deliberately chooses to do what is noble and right for its own sake. What is right in matters of moral conduct is usually a mean between two extremes. Chapter 1. Virtue then is twofold, partly intellectual and partly moral, and intellectual virtue is originated and fostered mainly by teaching. It demands, therefore, experience and time. Moral virtue, on the other hand, is the outcome of habit, and accordingly its name, ethike, is derived by a slight variation from ethos, habit. From this fact, it is clear that moral virtue is not implanted in us by nature, for nothing that exists by nature can be transformed by habit. Thus, a stone that naturally tends to fall downwards cannot be habituated or trained to rise upwards, even if we tried to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times. Nor again can fire be trained to sink downwards, nor anything else that follows one natural law be habituated or trained to follow another. It is neither by nature then, nor in defiance of nature that virtues grow in us. Nature gives us the capacity to receive them, and that capacity is perfected by habit. Again, if we take the various natural powers which belong to us, we first possess the proper faculties and afterwards display the activities. It is obviously so with the senses. Not by seeing frequently or hearing frequently do we acquire the sense of seeing or hearing. On the contrary, because we have the senses, we make use of them. We do not get them by making use of them, but the virtues we get by first practicing them, as we do in the arts. For it is by doing what we ought to do when we study the arts that we learn the arts themselves. We become builders by building, and harpists by playing the harp. Similarly, it is by doing just acts that we become just, by doing temperate acts that we become temperate, by doing brave acts that we become brave. The experience of states confirms this statement, for it is by training in good habits that lawmakers make the citizens good. This is the object all lawmakers have at heart. If they do not succeed in it, they fail of their purpose, and it makes the distinction between a good constitution and a bad one. Again, the causes and means by which any virtue is produced and destroyed are the same, and equally so in any part. For it is by playing the harp that both good and bad harpists are produced, and the case of builders and others is similar. For if it is by building well that they become good builders, and by building badly that they become bad builders. If it were not so, there would be no need of anybody to teach them. They would all be born good or bad in their several crafts. The case of the virtues is the same. It is by our actions in dealing between man and man that we become either just or unjust. It is by our actions in the face of danger and by our training ourselves to fear or to courage that we become either cowardly or courageous. It is much the same with our appetites and angry passions. People become temperate and gentle, others licentious and passionate, by behaving in one or the other way in particular circumstances. In a word, moral states are the result of activities like the state themselves. It is our duty, therefore, to keep a certain character in our activities, since our moral states depend on the differences in our activities. So the difference between one and another training and habits in our childhood is not a light matter, but important, or rather, all important. Chapter 2. Our present study is not, like other studies, purely theoretical in intention. For the object of our inquiry is not to know what virtue is, but how to become good, and that is the sole benefit of it. We must therefore consider the right way of performing actions, for it is acts, as we have said, that determine the character of the resulting moral states. That we should act in accordance with right reason is a common general principle, which may here be taken for granted. The nature of right reason and its relation to the virtues generally will be discussed later. But first of all, it must be admitted that all reasoning on matters of conduct must be like a sketch in outline. It cannot be scientifically exact. We began by laying down the principle that the kind of reasoning demanded in any subject must be such as the subject matter itself allows, and questions of conduct and expediency no more admit of hard and fast rules than questions of health. If this is true of general reasoning on ethics, still more true it is that scientific exactitude is impossible in treating of particular ethical cases. They do not fall under any art or law, but the actors themselves have always to take account of circumstances, as much as in medicine or navigation. Still, although such is the nature of our present argument, we must try to make the best of it. The first point to be observed is that in the matters we are now considering, deficiency and excess are both fatal. It is so we see in questions of health and strength. Parenthesis, we must judge of what we cannot see by the evidence of what we do see. End parenthesis. Too much or too little gymnastic exercise is fatal to strength. Similarly, too much or too little meat and drink is fatal to health, whereas a suitable amount produces, increases, and sustains it. It is the same with temperance, courage, and other moral virtues. A person who avoids and is afraid of everything and faces nothing becomes a coward. A person who is not afraid of anything but is ready to face everything becomes foolhardy. Similarly, he who enjoys every pleasure and abstains from none is licentious. He who refuses all pleasures, like a boor, is an insensible sort of person. For temperance and courage are destroyed by excess and deficiency, but preserved by the mean. Again, not only are the causes and agencies of production, increase, and destruction in moral states the same, but the field of their activity is the same also. It is so in other more obvious instances, as for example, strength. For strength is produced by taking a great deal of food and undergoing a great deal of exertion, and it is the strong man who is able to take the most food and undergo most exertion. So too with the virtues. By abstaining from pleasures we become temperate, and when we have become temperate, we are best able to abstain from them. So again with courage, it is by training ourselves to despise and face terrifying things that we become brave, and when we have become brave, we shall be best able to face them. The pleasure or pain which accompanies actions may be regarded as a test of a person's moral state. He who abstains from physical pleasures and feels pleasure in so doing is temperate, but he who feels pain at doing so is licentious. He who faces dangers with pleasure, or at least without pain, is brave, but he who feels pain at facing them is a coward, for moral virtue is concerned with pleasures and pains. It is pleasure which makes us do what is base, and pain which makes us abstain from doing what is noble. Hence the importance of having a certain training from very early days, as Plato says, so that we may feel pleasure and pain at the right objects, for this is true education. Chapter 3. But we may be asked what we mean by saying that people must become just by doing what is just and temperate by doing what is temperate. For it will be said, if they do what is just and temperate, they are already just and temperate themselves, in the same way as if they practice grammar and music, they are grammarians and musicians. But is this true even in the case of the arts? For a person may speak grammatically either by chance or at the suggestion of somebody else. Hence, he will not be a grammarian unless he not only speaks grammatically, but does so in a grammatical manner, that is, because of the grammatical knowledge which he possesses. There is a point of difference, too, between the arts and the virtues. The productions of art have their excellence in themselves. It is enough, then, that when they are produced, they themselves should possess a certain character. But acts in accordance with virtue are not justly or temperately performed simply because they are in themselves just or temperate. The doer at the same time of performing them must satisfy certain conditions. In the first place, he must know what he is doing. Secondly, he must deliberately choose to do it and do it for its own sake. And thirdly, he must do it as part of his own firm and immutable character. If it be a question of art, these conditions, except only the condition of knowledge, are not raised, but if it be a question of virtue, mere knowledge is of little or no avail. It is the other conditions which are the result of frequently performing just and temperate acts that are not slightly but all important. Accordingly, deeds are called just and temperate when they are such as a just and temperate person would do. And a just and temperate person is not merely one who does these deeds, but one who does them in the spirit of the just and the temperate. It may fairly be said then that a just man becomes just by doing what is just, and a temperate man becomes temperate by doing what is temperate. And if a man did not so act, he would not have much chance of becoming good. But most people, instead of acting, take refuge in theorizing. They imagine that they are philosophers and that philosophy will make them virtuous. In fact, they behave like people who listen attentively to their doctors but never do anything that their doctors tell them. But a healthy state of the soul will no more be produced by this kind of philosophizing than a healthy state of the body by this kind of medical treatment. Chapter 4. We have next to consider the nature of virtue. Now, as the properties of the soul are three, namely emotions, faculties, and moral states, it follows that virtue must be one of the three. By emotions I mean desire, anger, fear, pride, envy, joy, love, hatred, regret, ambition, pity, in a word, whatever feeling is attended by pleasure or pain. I call those faculties through which we are said to be capable of experiencing these emotions, for instance, capable of getting angry or being pained or feeling pity. And I call these moral states through which we are well or ill-disposed in our emotions, ill-disposed, for instance, in anger, if our anger be too violent or too feeble, and well-disposed if it be rightly moderate, and similarly in our other emotions. Now, neither the virtues nor the vices are emotions, for we are not called good or bad for our emotions, but for our virtues or vices. We are not praised or blamed simply for being angry, but only for being angry in a certain way. But we are praised or blamed for our virtues or vices. Again, whereas we are angry or afraid without deliberate purpose, the virtues are matters of deliberate purpose, or require deliberate purpose. Moreover, we are said to be moved by our emotions, but by our emotions or vices we are not said to be moved, but to have a certain disposition. For these reasons the virtues are not faculties, for we are not called either good or bad, nor are we praised or blamed for having simple capacity for emotion. Also, while nature gives us our faculties, it is not nature that makes us good or bad, but this point we have already discussed. If then the virtues are neither emotions nor faculties, all that remains is that they must be moral states. Chapter 5. The nature of virtue has been now described in kind, but it is not enough to say merely that virtue is a moral state. We must also describe the character of that moral state. We may assert then that every virtue or excellence puts into good condition that of which it is a virtue or excellence, and enables it to perform its work well. Thus, excellence in the eye makes the eye good and its function good, for by excellence in the eye we see well. Similarly, excellence of the horse makes a horse excellent himself and good at racing, at carrying its rider, and at facing the enemy. If then this rule is universally true, the virtue or excellence of a man will be such a moral state as makes a man good and able to perform his proper function well. How this will be the case we have already explained, but another way of making it clear will be to study the nature or character of virtue. Now, of everything, whether it be continuous or divisible, it is possible to take a greater, a smaller, or an equal amount. and this either in terms of the thing itself or in relation to ourselves. The equal being a mean between too much and too little, but the mean in terms of the thing itself. I understand that which is equally distinct from both its extremes, which is one and the same for every man. By the mean relatively to ourselves, I understand that which is neither too much nor too little for us, but this is not one nor the same for everybody. Thus, if 10 be too much and 2 too little, we take 6 as a mean in terms of the thing itself. For 6 is as much greater than 2 as it is less than 10. And this is a mean in arithmetical proportion. But the mean considered relatively to ourselves may not be ascertained in that way. It does not follow that if 10 pounds of meat is too much and 2 too little for a man, the trainer will order him 6 pounds, since this also may be too much or too little for him who is to take it. It will be too little, for example, for Milo, but too much for a beginner in gymnastics. The same with running and wrestling. The right amount will vary with the individual. This being so, the skillful in any art avoids alike excess and deficiency. He seeks and chooses the mean, not the absolute mean, but the mean considered relatively to himself. Every art then does its work well, if it regards the mean and judges the works it produces by the mean. For this reason, we often say of successful works of art that it is impossible to take anything away from them or to add anything to them, which implies that excess or deficiency is fatal to excellence, but that the mean state ensures it. Good artists, too, as we say, have an eye to the mean in their works. Now, virtue, like nature herself, is more accurate and better than any art. Virtue, therefore, will aim at the mean. I speak of moral virtue, since it is moral virtue which is concerned with emotions and actions, and it is in these we have excess and deficiency and the mean. Thus it is possible to go too far or not far enough in fear, pride, desire, anger, pity, and pleasure and pain generally, and the excess and the deficiency are alike wrong, but to feel these emotions at the right times, for the right objects, towards the right persons, for the right motives, and in the right manner, is the mean or the best good, which signifies virtue. Virtue is concerned with both emotions and actions, wherein excess is an error and deficiency a fault, while the mean is successful and praised, and success and praise are both characteristics of virtue. It appears then that virtue is a kind of mean because it aims at the mean. On the other hand, there are many different ways of going wrong, for evil is in its nature infinite. To use the Pythagorean phrase, but good is finite, and there is only one possible way of going right. So the former is easy and the latter is difficult. It is easy to miss the mark, but difficult to hit it. And so by our reasoning, excess and deficiency are characteristics of vice, and the mean is a characteristic of virtue. For good is simple, evil manifold. Chapter 6. Virtue then is a state of deliberate moral purpose, consisting in a mean relative to ourselves, the mean being determined by reason, or as a prudent man would determine it. It is a mean, firstly, as lying between two vices, the vice of excess on the one hand and the vice of deficiency on the other. And secondly, because whereas the vices either fall short of or go beyond what is right in emotion and action, virtue discovers and chooses the mean. Accordingly, virtue, if regarded in its essence or theoretical definition, is a mean, though if regarded from the point of view of what is best and most excellent, it is an extreme. But not every action or every emotion admits of a mean. There are some whose very name implies wickedness, as for example, malice, shamelessness, and envy among the emotions, and adultery, theft, and murder among the actions. All these and others like them are marked as intrinsically wicked, not merely the excesses or deficiencies of them. It is never possible then to be right in them. They are always sinful. Right or wrong in such acts as adultery does not depend on our committing it with the right woman at the right time or in the right manner. On the contrary, it is wrong to do it at all. It would be equally false to suppose that there can be a mean or an excess or deficiency in unjust, cowardly, or licentious conduct. For, if that were so, it would be a mean of excess and deficiency, an excess of deficiency and a deficiency of deficiency. But as in temperance and courage there can be no excess or deficiency, because the mean there is in a sense an extreme, so too in these other cases there cannot be a mean or an excess or deficiency. But however the acts are done, they are wrong. For in general, an excess or deficiency does not have a mean, nor a mean an excess or deficiency. Chapter 8. There are then three dispositions, two being vices, namely, excess and deficiency, and one, virtue, which is the mean between them, and they are all in a sense mutually opposed. The extremes are opposed both to the mean and to each other, and the mean is opposed to the extremes. For as the equal, if compared with the less, is greater, but if compared with the greater is less, so the mean state, whether in emotion or action, if compared with deficiency is excessive, but if compared with excess is deficient. Thus, the brave man appears foolhardy compared with the coward, but cowardly compared with the foolhardy. Similarly, the temperate man appears licentious compared with the insensible man, but insensible compared with the licentious. And the liberal man appears extravagant compared with the stingy man, but stingy compared with the spendthrift. The result is that the extremes each denounce the mean as belonging to the other extreme. The coward calls the brave man foolhardy, and the foolhardy man calls him cowardly, and so on in other cases. But while there is a mutual opposition between the extremes and the mean, there is greater opposition between the two extremes than between extreme and the mean, for they are further removed from each other than from the mean, as the great is further from the small, and the small from the great than either from the equal. Again, while some extremes show some likeness to the mean, as foolhardiness to courage and extravagance to liberality, there is the greatest possible dissimilarity between extremes. But things furthest removed from each other are called opposites. Hence, the further things are removed, the greater is the opposition between them. In some cases, it is deficiency, and in others excess, which is more opposed to the mean. Thus, it is not foolhardiness, an excess, but cowardice, a deficiency, which is more opposed to courage, nor is it insensibility, a deficiency, but licentiousness, an excess, which is more opposed to temperance. There are two reasons why this should be so. One lies in the nature of the matter itself, for when one of two extremes is nearer and more like the mean, it is not this extreme, but its opposite that we chiefly contrast with the mean. For instance, as foolhardiness seems more like and nearer to courage than cowardice, it is cowardice that we chiefly contrast with courage, for things further removed from the mean seem to be more opposite to it. This reason lies in the nature of the matter itself. There is a second which lies in our own nature. The things to which we ourselves are naturally more inclined, we think more opposed to the mean. Thus we are ourselves naturally more inclined to pleasures than to their opposites, and are more prone therefore to self-indulgence than to moderation. Accordingly, we speak of those things in which we are more likely to run to great lengths as more opposed to the mean. Hence, licentiousness, which is an excess, seems more opposed to temperance than insensibility. Chapter 9. We have now sufficiently shown that moral virtue is a mean, and in what sense it is so, that it is a mean as lying between two vices, a vice of excess on the one hand, and a vice of deficiency on the other, and as aiming at the mean in emotion and action. That is why it is so hard to be good, for it is always hard to find the mean in anything. It is not everyone, but only a man of science who can find the mean or center of a circle. So too anybody can get angry. That is easy. And anybody can give or spend money. But to give it to the right person, to give the right amount of it, at the right time, for the right cause, and in the right way, this is not what anybody can do, nor is it easy. That is why goodness is rare and praise worthy and noble. One, then, who aims at a mean must begin by departing from the extreme that is more contrary to the mean. He must act in the spirit of Calypso's advice. Far from this spray and swell hold thou thy ship. For of the two extremes, one is more wrong than the other. As it is difficult to hit the mean exactly, we should take the second best course, as the saying is, and choose the lesser of two evils. This we shall best do in the way described, that is, steering clear of the evil which is further from the mean. We must also note the weakness to which we are ourselves particularly prone, since different natures tend in different ways, and we may ascertain what our tendency is by observing our feelings of pleasure and pain. Then we must drag ourselves away towards the opposite extreme, for by pulling ourselves as far as possible from what is wrong, we shall arrive at the mean, as we do when we pull a crooked stick straight. In all cases, we must especially be on our guard against the pleasant or pleasure, for we are not impartial judges of pleasure. Hence, our attitude towards pleasure must be like that of the elders of the people in the Iliad towards Helen, and we must constantly apply the words they use. For if we dismiss pleasure as they dismissed Helen, we shall be less likely to go wrong. By action of this kind, to put it summarily, we shall best succeed in hitting the mean. Undoubtedly, this is a difficult task, especially in individual cases. It is not easy to determine the right manner, objects, occasion, and duration of anger. Sometimes we praise people who are deficient in anger and call them gentle, and at other times we praise people who exhibit a fierce temper as high-spirited. It is not, however, a man who deviates a little from goodness, but one who deviates a great deal, whether on the side of excess or of deficiency, that is blamed, for he is sure to call attention to himself. It is not easy to decide in theory how far and to what extent a man may go before he becomes blameworthy, but neither is it easy to define in theory anything else in the region of the senses. Such things depend on circumstances, and our judgment of them depends on our perception. So much then is plain, that the mean is everywhere praiseworthy, but that we ought to aim at one time towards an excess and at another towards a deficiency, for thus we shall most easily hit the mean, or in other words, reach excellence.